Hello and welcome to another episode of the AgNext Podcast, where we are always excited to tell you about what is next from AgNext. Today we are joined by Dr. Tyler Cozzens, Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, to discuss the situation and outlook for cattle and dairy markets. Let's get into it. Tyler, thank you for joining us. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. The very first time having you here, but hopefully this will be recurring episodes for us.
Yes.
So thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role?
Sure. I guess a little bit about myself. Originally from northern Colorado, town called Ritten, so just straight east of CSU campus here. I grew up on a fifth generation livestock and crop operation. So I grew up around cattle and lambs. We've gone away a little bit from the livestock side of things, but we're all crops, so we raise corn, sugar beets, pinto beans, and alfalfa hay. So that's kind of my background, where I came from. I went to CSU to get my education, got my doctorate degree in agricultural economics here at CSU. And then after that, finished graduate school and went to work for USDA's Foreign Ag Service in Washington, D.C., doing situation and outlook analysis for global production and trade of livestock and meat. Did that for about 4 years and then came back to Colorado, wanted to get back home, closer to family, and started working for Livestock Marketing Information Center. So that was about 7 years ago. Became the director about 2 years ago. And so been in that role, been enjoying it quite a bit. But just a little bit of background on LMIC, who we are, what we do. So we are part of the land-grant university extension mission. So we're housed under Colorado State University's extension services. But we do work with 29 land-grant universities, right? So our scope is national. So a lot of our work is, day-to-day work is market analysis, a lot of data collection, validation, analysis, just kind of what's going on in the markets day-to-day, week-to-week, so forth. So a lot of that effort is to just support the work of other extension professors across the U.S. To give them the information, the data, the analysis, and just the perspective, an unbiased perspective on the markets. And so we're a little bit behind the scenes, and that's by design. So, but happy to talk to you guys. So thank you.
Well, thanks for being here. I love that you're from Eaton. As you know, I live on that part of, on that side of Colorado. Mm-hmm. So happy to have you here today. And thank you for that description. Sure. One of the reports that just came out from your shop is the Margin Markets report. Can you kind of just give us a high-level overview of what that report is, how frequently it comes out, how our listeners could get it, and then we'll kind of get into the report itself.
Yeah, sure. So the Margins and Markets was an effort that started about the time I came to LMIC, and so it's a quarterly report, but it's a little bit more in depth, a little bit more robust analysis than what we typically do. So we cover cow-calf sector, cattle feeding sector, dairy sector, hog sector, and poultry sector, right? And so this is really just sort of a kind of current situation discussion, what's going on, but also giving kind of an outlook perspective, what's going on in the next 6, maybe 12 months in each of these markets. So we kind of keep it a little bit higher level, but touch on kind of the key things that are going on, right? A lot of supply and price discussion, trade and demand are some of those other things that we touch on too. So really it's kind of a bigger picture discussion to kind of give what's a current look going on and what's our expectation. And so we do this quarterly. And so if you want to get more information on this, feel free to reach out to me and we can try and get that in your hands.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So to continue on that kind of current situation and outlook, I know you do a lot more than just focus on each of those commodities. Start big picture for me, if you would. So given the current economic conditions, right, global issues that we all know are going on, like what do you think are broad impacts that producers should be concerned of or maybe aware of as they're making their decisions for this year?
Yeah, so I think I'll start a little bit more with like a global perspective. That's kind of how I start off a lot of my talks when I talk to a lot of producer groups, is kind of like, let's start big picture and then start to funnel it down. And so one of the big things that I always talk about is GDP, gross domestic product, right? That's kind of that main economic measure that we have for the economy. Been fairly steady, right? But then if we start extrapolating that a little bit more to the global, right? Obviously there's some geopolitical issues that are going on. We don't need to go to that in depth, but I think from a producer standpoint, right, I think it's very noticeable to see that like gas prices, diesel prices, right, they're $1.50 higher than what they were a month ago, right? So very soon, right? So you're talking some of those inflationary pressures, right? Is this going to be short term? Is this going to be long term, right? Those are kind of the questions, looming questions. But I think it's something that you have to think about because you have to make some of these decisions based on the information that you have. And so, those are kind of some of the current issues that we're looking at. And, you kind of have to keep that in mind from just production decisions and how that's going to factor into just the overall economy and the consumer itself, their purchasing power to go out and buy goods, whether that's beef or pork or chicken. And so, will they start slowing down or changing up their purchasing behavior and habits? And what are the ripple effects of that? And so that's one of the big things that we look at. I think the hard thing is, and this as in economics, is always kind of a rear view with a lot of that stuff. And so it's a little bit tricky. And so sometimes you're trying to draw, well, this kind of happened, 5 years ago, 4 years ago, kind of draw some analog years. And so I think that's one of the tricky things right now. And so, for me, I've kind of been looking like, well, 2022, we had some similar geopolitical issues going on, right? And so kind of drawing some of those parallels. And a talk I just gave, I said, the history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And so that's kind of one of the things that I try and look at and say, well, if it keeps going, this is potentially what we might be looking at: inflationary pressures. The consumer changes up their demand behavior and patterns and how they purchase goods. And so then that's where we start to see more of the longer term effects from a bigger macro discussion.
And how's that going to impact, let's say, beef producers immediately? What are your things that you're thinking about as diesel and gas prices increase? We might see consumer buying habits shift, even going into the summer months, which is of course an exciting time, especially for beef. What are you cautioning producers around?
Sure. Well, I think for the producer, right, these are they're seeing very good prices.
Sure.
Record. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So from a profit standpoint, right, I think it's wise to consider that, these are very good prices. Take the money when you can, but also realize that the cure for high prices is high prices. Right. And so these prices are going to start moving down. And so you kind of have to, you can't be thinking now. You need to be thinking a little bit farther, year, 2 years. It depends on your operation and what you want to do. But kind of to the note of some of the higher diesel and gas prices, when that occurred about 4 years ago, we did see beef demand go down, right? We look at that from just our demand indices that we have internally and how we calculate that, and that did occur, right? And so I think that's the larger concern. I'm not trying to be like a doom and gloom economist or anything, but I think that's sort of the reality of this. Is right. These are real things that factor into the psychology and just the decision making of the consumer, and watching that to see how this plays out. But I think, as you said, right, we're going into the summer grilling season. We're a little over a month away from that, and that's where we start to really see demand ramp up. And so I would expect that still to occur largely, because I think there's always kind of that winter, trying to break out of the winter freeze and get out and do stuff outside. And so that's a very typical seasonal pattern that we see in beef prices, specifically wholesale prices. So, that's one of those things we'll be watching for. And we're only a few weeks away from that. And so we can start to see what's actually going on in the market from just positioning of cattle within the supply chain, and just weekly slaughter and things of that nature. So we can get a little bit more acute, realize the seasonal pattern, but we can start to get in and hone in on some of those overall supply pictures and how the industry is maybe positioning itself as far as expectations from a demand standpoint over the summer.
Sure. And those costs are also going to increase, of course, for our producers at large, which I think is important just for them to consider as well. As we sort of talk about costs, the Margin of Markets report goes into kind of weather conditions as well. Some concerning reports as it relates to weather, specifically with drought, hay and feed availability, prices. Can you kind of summarize that for our listeners, and then perhaps just provide some if I would, that Tyler's family is doing X type thinking.
Sure. So I think it's this, I guess, kind of jumping to the point here, right? Drought in the Western U.S. is quite severe right now, quite honestly. You look at a snowpack map for the Western U.S. and it is red. Like there's not much moisture out there. And so
anywhere.
Yeah. And so like, it's quite concerning, and, kind of anecdotal stuff, talking with my dad and my brother, who are a little bit more in tune with that, the water aspect of things. Like it's going to be tough. It's going to be a tough summer here, specifically in Colorado, but I would say the Western U.S. So quite honestly, I'm kind of a brace for impact sort of a mindset right now. And it's a little bit doom and gloom, but I think it's the reality, right? Because, my travels, kind of in the Western U.S. here in the last month or 2 months has been, it's a lot of producers are pretty steady as she goes. Let's put it that way. They're not really making big decisions because of this drought situation, because they've been through this before, right? I'm kind of thinking like 2011, 2012, it was very similar drought picture. And so my concern is then we've come off a couple of good years with moisture and just production of forage, range and land pasture conditions. And now we're getting into a pretty dry season. And so, the concern would be just available feed, available range of pasture. So we have pretty good hay stocks, but we won't get the next report until May, end of May, basically, to give us an idea of what kind of stocks are out there that, how much did we feed over the winter, and then how much is left to feed potentially over the summer. And so, if you're that producer that's maybe considering making some decisions of herd expansion, right, evaluate if you have the feed. If you have to go purchase it, how far do you have to, is it local? Do you have to purchase it? What's the shipping costs? Things of that nature, that factors into it. Because these cattle that you have are quite valuable. And so, there's a couple ways of looking at it. And I think, John, we talked about this a little bit, was just, can you purchase the feed and still make it profitable, or do you sell them? Because you can make a pretty penny on them, right? And so it just depends on the operation. But I think there's a couple of things to consider, right? And it's all kind of unique to the producer. But I think this whole drought picture is definitely one that I'm harping on quite a bit. So it's concerning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And again, Tyler's crystal ball here. Does this limit our herd expansion, right? That the industry has been kind of pushing for, and I think the market's been asking for that too. Of course, do we see that limited for another year, likely, with this sort of weather?
I think so, especially here in the Western U.S. I think there's going to be some regions where you're probably some expansion. I was up in kind of north. I was in Montana, kind of the eastern center part of the state, and they weren't concerned about drought. Like there are plenty of haystacks out there. So I say that I think there's probably some regions where you're going to see potentially some expansion, sure. But I think here more localized, it's definitely a headwind. And I think you get southern plains, you're definitely probably going to see some more of that impact there. But you get east of that, they've had some pretty good snowstorms here and through the winter, and so I think it's going to be regionalized, but I think it's definitely going to be a headwind. And we, not to touch on it too much, but in Nebraska, I mean, they had the huge wildfires there, and that's very good cow-calf country, to really support rebuilding efforts. And so I think from a more regionalized impact, you're definitely going to see some of that. And so I would argue probably some slowing down here.
Sure.
Right. And so if we start to extrapolate that a little bit more from a just a beef supplies demand kind of picture, right? I mean, that starts pushing us out there another 2-3 years as far as when we actually see the supply start to move higher. And, demand is just phenomenal right now. And a demand picture that we've seen hold steady here for the better part of 5, 6, arguably 7 years. And so, I'm kind of, the cautious optimistic of like, it's strong, but when's it going to slow down?
Sure.
And so, this herd rebuilding effort, it's very much needed because the demand is there. But I think there's other factors at play here. Drought being one of those, capital availability. And so I think there's just a lot of decisions that are being made and kind of strategic decisions by these producers that they're considering, and they have to for their operations. So,
absolutely. You bring up demand, and I think it's interesting, right? As we watch this, we're dealing with drought. This herd is likely not going to expand hugely, right? To where we actually probably need it to feel confident in, how much beef is costing consumers in the store. As you sort of forecast that out, do you see further contraction happening in the packing sector as well, right? I mean, they've not been profitable for another number of years now. We've got high prices for cattle coming in. I mean, I can't imagine the feed yards are going to be profitable too much longer, especially in drought. Feed costs are going to be going up. How do you see us kind of balance that out? Are we going to pull more imports in? That's challenging in this political climate. What do you see, Tyler?
Yeah, so I think if we try and dissect that a little bit here, I'd like to step back a little bit here and talk about a little bit of that demand picture a little bit more, right? So if we think about the consumer and what they're demanding, right? I mean, I sit here and I would say my demand is I want a steak every day, right? Can I afford that realistically, right?
Yes, please.
No, right? And so you also have to think about, is it wise to have a 16-ounce steak, a T-bone steak every day, right? So you think about the consumer, and if that's for one person, what if they're feeding a family of 4? It starts to get expensive rather quickly.
Very expensive. Yeah. I am one of those families of 4.
Fair enough. So if you think about just sort of the consumer standing at the meat case, making a purchasing decision, and assuming from our economic theory that they're price conscious, right? And they're going to choose the lowest price to maximize their utility, right? Their happiness of whatever, meat protein source they want to consume. Steaks, is that too expensive? Okay. So then they start looking through the meat case. What about a roast, right? That goes a little bit farther for a family of 4, a little bit cheaper. Okay. What if that's still too expensive? Then you're kind of at ground beef, right? And that's where you're kind of hitting the as far as the wholesale cuts or just the retail cuts that the consumer can purchase. That is arguably the cheapest, right? It's probably the most versatile, easiest to cook, goes a little bit farther, right? You can have the same discussion for pork and chicken, okay? So you kind of factor that in, and I think that's where I kind of am throwing caution to this demand picture, because I think we've kind of gotten to that ground beef demand where it's like, okay, this is approaching $7 a pound, right? And I have some friends that are paying $10 a pound for, the
Premium,
better.
sure.
Right. And so, and the one buddy of mine, he just said that he was paying $10 a pound. Now it just went up to $12.50. Right. And so I was like, you going to keep buying it? And he's like, yeah, cause he's like, I enjoy it. Right. But he's changing up some of his other consumption patterns. Right. And so, I think we, Americans, we kind of have a fascination with burgers, cheeseburgers, it's a very American thing. And so I think that's probably the bigger one that I'm watching is that ground beef market.
Okay.
So, that's kind of that demand picture. And so, kind of talking about the import side of things that you had brought up, right? So we kind of back that out a little bit. When we look at imports, right, I sort of look at the beef that we produce here in the U.S., high quality, right? We're feeding these cattle heavier. We're getting a lot more fat trim off of them, okay? So we need to do something with that fat trim. We don't have enough lean product, right? We're not slaughtering enough cold cows, okay? Because that's where we get a lot of that lean product. Because we've culled the herd so far, arguably we're going to get a little bit more from the dairy sector because of the expansion that we've seen there. So then we start looking to our international partners, okay? And so that's where we're getting a little bit more of those lean product to grind with our 50%, right? So it's a little bit of a give and take here in the domestic market to get some of that ground product. And so, but if we kind of step back even further from a global standpoint and look at just overall beef production, right? USDA's Foreign Ag Service, where I worked prior to my role here, right? We were forecasting a lot of these just global supplies of cattle and beef. And the two main suppliers are going to be Australia and Brazil, New Zealand to a degree, Argentina, like places like that. There's overall cattle herd globally is trending lower here for the next couple of years, right? So if we think about just overall global supply is available, it is tightening, right? So there's going to be some pushing and pulling here for just overall supplies globally to meet some of this ground beef demand, and arguably the U.S. has some of that stronger demand.
I want to build on that just a little bit. And so I think everyone's heard a lot in recent years about the cow numbers, right? National cow herd at the lowest in 70 plus years, right? Give or take a few. I don't hear as much talk about domestic beef production, right? So we have fewer cows, but I want to get your take on the beef we actually produce domestically, but then maybe speak a little about how we've been able to do that, and then how we've done that in the last couple of years, specifically in response to higher prices, right? We seem to be kind of expanding, doing more with less. And do you see any maybe long-term implications of continuing that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think that's some more discussion on this demand side. I would argue this is really the demand strength that we're seeing right now was built on decisions in the cattle sector that were made 20, 30 years ago, whereas really a shift towards, okay, it's about the consumer. What do they want? Eating experience, flavor, palatability. I mean, you kind of go down the list, right? And we're seeing a lot of that play out now, right? We have a consumer that understands beef. They understand what they're going to get, and they know what the experience is going to be like. So they're going to come back and pay for it and purchase it. And so, and a lot of that shows up in, if we start looking at the number of cattle that are graded prime choice, high choice, right, versus select, right? We've seen a much more of a shift towards the high choice prime graded cattle. And so you have a much better quality profile out there. And so you have a consumer, I would argue you have a consumer that is very much in tune with that and understands when they go to the store what choice means, right? What prime means, what they're going to get. And so I think you have a consumer that's much more educated on what they're purchasing. And so I think that speaks volumes to the cattle sector and what the decisions that they've made, and then the efforts that they've made to develop a consumer base that is this strong.
Let's go back to expansion on the dairy side. You mentioned that herd is expanding. Milk prices, however, are not great. Help us understand why.
Sure.
Why that dairy herd is expanding, and what producers should be thinking about on the dairy side.
So as an economist, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about supply and demand, right? And so, right, if we see supplies go up, right, we assume prices will go down, all else equal, meaning demand does not change, right? And I would argue that's largely what we're seeing, but I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Sure.
Demand for some of those components, right, has been strong, specifically kind of butter and cheese. And that was kind of in 2025 where we saw a lot of that, right? Some of that kind of waned towards the end of 2025, and prices have still been a little bit tough here, but we've seen them move higher, right? Still below a year ago, but moving higher, right? So we're seeing some of that demand profile start to pick up again, right? But when you add about 150, 200,000 cows to the milking herd, right? It definitely does factor into just overall supply availability and therefore prices. And so we have to kind of factor in some of the component side of it, right? So it's like there's a few of the components that are doing well, but some of them may not be, right? So it's kind of a pushing and a pulling in the dairy sector there, right? And some of this could be regionalized too, right? Where we see an expansion in processing facilities, right? That factors into some of this too, right? And, don't want to get too much into this if you want to, but, the kind of the beef on dairy thing has gotten a lot of traction, right? And so from a profitability standpoint, it's really supporting that revenue side of the profit equation. Mm-hmm. And so, I think that's one of those things that we don't have a firm grasp on it quite yet. It's a little bit of a, still trying to figure out how that is factoring into the market on the cattle side, but also on the dairy side. But yes, it definitely has impacted those milk prices. And so, but they're also seeing lower feed costs though too, right? Corn's fairly still cheap and hay still is to a degree, right? But I think we mentioned some of that drought side and that could change, right? And that's the reality of it. But I think the dairy is around where we live. Seems like they got feed just piled all over the place. And so I'm like,
it does.
I get it though,
sure.
Right? I mean, they're
and maybe
they
should have, right?
Yeah.
I mean, somebody who's been planning for a number of years may have stockpiled hay for quite some time.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do we see any additional liquidation in the dairy herd coming, or do you think it's going to hold based on that beef on dairy revenue and cheese and butter demand?
Yeah, so kind of our forecast at LMIC is we do see some shrinking of the herd.
Okay.
I think these cold cow prices that we're seeing, they're very strong.
Sure.
Right, just that demand for ground product.
Sure.
And so that's a viable revenue stream that you have to consider. And so age of the milking herd, things of those kind of nature, we have to consider those. And so we do have it declining about 50 to maybe 70,000 head here in 2026, kind of our expectation. So probably keep prices pretty similar to where they were in 2025 is our expectation for the dairy sector, milk prices.
Great.
All right, I'm going to jump back to something I understand more than the dairies. Going back to the cow-calf sector, obviously prices are strong. We talk about, record prices. Pretty good in terms of profitability as well. My concern, I'd like your opinion on this, is to Kim's point earlier, we've kind of seen cost creep as well, right? And so if I were consider expanding, the national herd or at a regional level, what are things I need to be concerned with? Not just prices, but I know you've done some work on kind of farm income forecasts, also, interest rates, things of that nature. Like what are the compelling reasons to not expand right now? And then maybe to get away from the dismal science that both of us study, right? What are some points of optimism?
Sure. So I think it depends which side of the coin you're on, right? One of the things I always kind of talk about with kind of the cow-calf sector is if you're going to expand, how are you going to expand, right? Are you going to go out and purchase some heifers, bred cows? Those are expensive, very expensive, right? And a few of the talks that I've been in, and this goes back well over a year, some of these producers are like, a decade ago, I was buying $3,000, heifers, and it took me 10 years to pay them off. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's a little bit of the reality of this is you have to have sort of an expectation for arguably, I would argue, the next 4 to 5 years, what prices are going to be. Mm-hmm. And so, heifers are not $3,000 right now. Okay. I mean, we're talking potentially double that. Yep. In some cases that I've heard anecdotally. And so, if you're looking to expand, you have to consider that, right? And how many calves are you going to get off of her to actually pay for her? Then you start making money, right? Are we talking 2, 3, 4, right? And CSU Extension has a lot of those sort of tools to look into. And if you're a person considering that, I would highly recommend spend some time with that. And that's one of the things I've talked about in some of my talks, because that's really, you need to put some pencil to paper, because this is not a 1-year decision if you're going to do that, right? This is a multi-year, I would argue 5 to 10 year decision. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one big thing to consider here. I was up in Wyoming at a bull sale a little over a week ago, and some of those bulls were going for $10,000. Most of them were about 5 to 6, right? Still, right? You need to purchase a bull. What is that going to cost? So that because that's again sort of a longer term decision. But and you mentioned the interest rate side of things, right? And that's a little bit more of a macro item that we bring up. But I think it's very relevant, and I've put it in most of my talks for the last year, arguably, and so because if you think about the cattle cycle being about 10 years, this one's probably going to be 12, maybe, right? So if we go back a decade where interest rates they were very low, near zero, okay? And so if we fast forward to where we are now, they're 3 percentage points higher, right? And so then if you're purchasing cows that are potentially double what they were a decade ago, right? So you kind of have a double whammy that hits you there on just the cost side of things. And so I sort of bring that up as one of those points for the consumer and the producer sitting in the room. Like we're talking about this from a producer standpoint, okay, but the consumer's saying the same interest rate impacts, okay, and so, right, the thing I point out with the interest rates, right, that's just an easy way for the Fed to sort of throttle the economy, right, speed it up, slow it down. It's an easy lever to pull, and so these interest rates moving lower is definitely in the positive direction. But if we start to see some of this inflationary pressure that we've seen, that impacts the consumer and the producer. And so, those are some of those things that I touch on. I don't know if that fully answers your question, or if you had other thoughts on that.
I mean, yeah, that's some great insight. My My concern is we're in a bit of a catch-22, right? Because right now prices are so high, it's really hard to expand. But if I wait too long until prices come back down, then all of my offspring aren't worth as much. So there's got to, I mean, it seems like there's some opportunity for people that are in the right, maybe equity standpoint, right? Or have some access to cheaper capital, or have enough
forage.
Yeah, I was going to say feed that you don't have to pay a lot for. So there might be some opportunities out there. So I guess, you know, what are your thoughts? Like what would you tell people that might be hesitant about expanding, but have some forage base, or maybe, you know, have gotten some rains in the last year, or snow, right, depending on part of the country? Like why should they consider expansion, rather than, I'm also kind of in your boat here that I can make a lot of money right now. Why would I invest a lot of money if I can cash out a little bit right now?
Yeah, and so I think it's a little bit of a decision on the individual producer, right? But I think if they have the ability to expand and the interest, right? Are you willing to put in the labor and the time and all this? That's one of those things you have to consider. You know, but I think if you want to kind of keep your herd pretty steady, there's like selling some heifers. You know, I mean, you could cash flow very well, right? You know, but if you want to expand and you're willing to kind of take that risk, if you have the capital to go and purchase it, I think strongly consider it. But if you have to go borrow capital to purchase, that's a whole different discussion. And that's where the whole interest rate thing comes into that discussion there. And so, but I would say most of the producers that I've talked to have said we're just going to keep it steady, because I think they're concerned about just potential for the next couple of years. And you know, I would argue most producers are fairly risk averse. I'm making a broad assumption based on my upbringing, you know, but there's also some of the others that like to gamble. And so I think it's just all up to your risk preference and your profile of what you're willing to take on there. But I think it's, no matter which way you're gonna be profitable for the next couple of years. It's just kind of depends on your operation.
We haven't talked specifically yet about the cattle feeder. Clearly, we've talked about potential feed prices increasing. Clearly, feeder cattle prices are high. What else are cattle feeders thinking about right now?
Sure. Yeah. Well, obviously supplies, right? Do they have enough cattle coming through the supply chain to fill their pens, right? You know, because they're a cost minimizer when you think about it from an economic standpoint, right? So they need to get those cattle in there, keep those pens filled, but they also need to have cheap feed and put weight on them. And so, you know, supplies of cattle, but then the input side of all feed, right? They have corn that's under $5, kind of hitting $5 potentially. Still a lot of the growing season ahead for corn, you know, and what's actually going to play out there. So you have that, but we talked a lot about the hay availability, right? That's the other side of the input feed side of things. It's still fairly cheap, but how much is this drought picture really going to start to impact us as we get through the summer? So what we're seeing as far as some of those supply trends, you know, they're seeing the supply side get tighter. So one of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years is they're just keeping these cattle on feed longer.
Yep.
Okay. And so you get these dress weights that have gone up 2-3% every year, right? And arguably compared to a year ago, dress weights are 20-25 pounds higher, right? I mean, these are some
impressive.
It is.
Yes.
It is, right? And so I think that goes back to some of this discussion about just the decisions that were made from a genetic standpoint 20, 30 years ago. We're seeing some of that still play out now, just purely from just the genetics of how big we can get these cattle. And so, you know, that's one of the things that we're seeing, and it's a trend that's probably not going to go away. I would argue what would probably change that is if we see corn go well above $5, $6, hay that goes closer to $200. That's going to start eating away at just that profit side of things for the feedlot sector. So, you know, but this also goes back to them being on feed for longer periods of time, 150, 180, in some cases 200 plus days. You know, that's where we're getting the heavier carcass weights, but that also means we're getting more of that fat trim, right? And this goes back to that whole discussion that we had with the ground beef discussion, right? So, you know, I think that the sector is figuring out how to handle this stuff, and I think it's working out quite well in their favor right now. How sustainable is this? I think that's probably the bigger question. If we start seeing supplies get tighter, you know, and obviously for the last year, we haven't had about 1 million head of cattle come in from Mexico, right? So, you know, that's arguably disproportionately harmed or limited the southern feedlots. And so, there's some changing of just the landscape as part of that. Are we going to see some changes in there? There's some discussions from Secretary Rollins at USDA about that. How does that actually play out? What kind of, are we actually going to see a phased in process for all of that? And so I think those are some of the questions that are sort of looming for the cattle feeding sector, and how that actually plays out. But I think, we've been into that part of it from the import side of things for the better part of a year. And so I would argue some of those shifts have already sort of
taken place.
Sure. So,
Sure. As you think about the next 5 years, what are you optimistic about?
I think I talked quite a bit about the demand side. I think demand is still going to be very strong for the next 5 years. I think, are we going to be able to meet that demand, right? So I think there's definitely optimism for the cattle sector and the individual producer to look towards, right? And this is not something new. I think this is something that has been in place for a number of years. So I don't really see that going anywhere anytime soon. And so I think for the producer, some optimism to know that the hard work that they've put in is paying dividends for them right now. And so a lot of it for them, I think, is just going to be what's kind of the best decision for you and your individual operation to stay profitable, viable, and potentially moving on to the next generation or whatever that looks like. I think there's definitely a lot to be considering from a demand standpoint, but I think it's also from a profitability standpoint, looking at if you're going to start thinking about the next 5-10 years from your operation, what are things you need to consider about, right? Do you have enough range and land to maintain the herd that you have, or can you expand? If you want to expand, is there land around you to expand into? And what does that cost? Do you purchase it? Do you lease it? Like, what does that look like? And so that's where you really have to put kind of pencil to paper, right? And look at some of those scenarios. And so that's kind of the nerd economist that I am. That's the things that I look at, right? Because I think if you can do that and put it on the paper and so forth, it takes out some of the emotion. Because I think that's a tricky thing, right? Because I watched my dad deal with that because, I was growing up in the farm crisis era and just sitting at the kitchen table and hearing him talk about things. I didn't realize what was going on, but I look back now and I'm like, that was tough. That was really tough, right? And so some of those discussions were 5-10 years. What does this look like? Yep. And I think that's that's just being a savvy business person, in my opinion, right? Having some longer term perspective. It's hard. It really is, because you're stuck in the day-to-day things, but it's taking a step back and saying, okay, what do I want, right? What is the best interest for the operation?
I guess to follow up on that a little bit, given that we do have relatively strong profitability right now, there might be some opportunities for producers, right? We also talked about some challenges, increasing costs, right? Uncertainty in the market globally, as well as uncertain forage production this year. And so kind of bringing it back into the shorter term, what are some data points that you would consider people, follow, can look at, pay attention to, and maybe decision points that they would make? We hear a lot of, especially in the West right now, about drought management plans. Like, when do you pull cattle off pasture? When do you early wean? Do you cull some more cows versus maybe there's an opportunity now I can go obtain some more land because I've got some cash flow this year that I maybe didn't have 5 or 10 years ago, the last time we went through this. And so what should people look to? Are there specific programs, maybe insurance opportunities this year that may be less or more favorable than in years past? Sure.
I wouldn't say I spend a whole lot of time on the insurance side of things, but like LRP is definitely one of those that I think should be considered. And there's some of the discussions that I've had is I think there's opportunities for education on that too, right? It's a little bit of you don't really know until you get into it kind of a thing, but I think it's definitely one of those things that from a producer, anytime you can sort of mitigate risk away from yourself is prudent, right? And something to consider to make yourself a little bit more viable from a profitability standpoint, right? And that sort of mitigates some of the price risk doing the LRP type things. But I think back to maybe some of the decision points and stuff, right? We've kind of getting out of that calving season, right? Mm-hmm. And so do you have range of pasture to graze them on, wean them on, right? will you consider if you have to purchase some hay or things, what does that cost? Do you maybe sell them at a little bit lighter weight than you typically would, or can you hold them a little bit longer? I think those are all decisions that have to be, and that depends on the producer and their operation. But I think those are some of the things you have to consider. Do you even have the feed for them? Mm-hmm. And how long can you hold them? Like carrying capacity for them. And if you kind of look at some of the seasonal prices, right? Obviously the fall run for calves is kind of late August-ish, kind of through November-ish timeframe. And so, that's when we typically see that supply come to the market to go into those feedlots and so forth. Are you kind of in that same marketing time plan, right? Could you switch that up a little bit, go a little bit earlier, potentially? Maybe you get a little bit better price, right? You might sell them at a little bit lower weight, but could you get a little bit better price, right? And so I think that's right. Obviously that depends on your operation and how you're set up, but I think those are just some things to look at from a seasonality standpoint, right? Because in my line of work, a lot of things you look at, what are seasonal trends? Yep. When do you see the peaks? When do you see the lows, right? And that fall run is when you see one of those kind of lows for just feeder prices. And so, can you change up your marketing strategy just a little bit? Might bring you a little bit more revenue.
Yeah, I would agree. We've actually done a bunch of work out in the Eastern Plains as well. And we typically see 2/3 of our gains on yearlings right in the first half of the grazing season. And then those cool seasons kind of come in and we don't gain as well. And so we did some analysis, and most years we actually make more money selling kind of early to mid-September versus October 1, which is when most of the producers out there they're a little bit lighter, right? But we're not going to add a lot of weight in the month of September in our region at least, and those prices do start to decline. And so it's one option to maybe extend some of those forage resources. I'd like your thoughts too on this, because I get asked a lot. I'm never sure of what a good answer could or should be. But if we have money to invest and expand, right, should I focus on my cow herds and my genetics, or should I expand my land base? And so kind of two different asset classes, right?
Yeah.
And like I don't think there's a right answer here, right? Yeah. It's going to be specific and dependent on the individual operation, but just what are your thoughts on that, given your travels across the West?
Well, I mean, land values have trended higher, right? And so if I've kind of heard my dad and some of the neighbors say that you only get one time in your life to buy your neighbor's farm, one time, right? And so consider that if you have the capital, right? Mm-hmm. But if you are constrained by land and you can't expand your herd, then maybe you should be looking at land. But I think if you have the land and the carrying capacity to expand, then maybe you look at that, right? And how much can your land actually carry? Like how many, like a cow-calf pair, things of that nature. How much can they actually hold, and how much can you expand, and how much should you push the land, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's a loaded question, but I think it's a fair question, right? Because those are kind of the two main things for the producer. But I think the way I see it is, at this point in the game, you can't go wrong with either one of those. The way I see it. So I know that's kind of an answer, non-answer sort of a thing, that's but great. I love it. I think it's if you have the opportunity to purchase land, go for it. But if you have cash burn a hole in your pocket, buy some cows too. I have a neighbor of ours. He purchased some 3-year-old cows about a year ago, and he paid about $3,700, almost $4,000 for them, right? But he did that strategically because the age of his herd, he had a gap in 3-year-olds. Right, so he's trying to make sure that his age was uniform. And so that's one of the other things that I've sort of brought up, and some of these producers have asked me is, we don't really know the age of this herd. Is it young? Is it old? Right? And so, something to consider is, do you want to have a diverse age range in your herd? I think that's up to your individual discretion. Do you want to have a younger, older? I don't know. But I think that's something to consider. And so he was willing to make that purchase because he wanted the 3-year-olds, but he also knew he was buying them from, right? So he knew some of the genetic potential and things of that nature. That's another thing to consider there. And so it was a strategic move on his part, knowing what he's going to get from those cows and just sort of what he wanted to do with his herd moving forward. So he was making the decision, like, I know what I can do with my land, but I also know what I need to do with my herd. Mm-hmm. And so it's a little bit of a twofold thing. So he wasn't looking at the land side of it. He was looking at the herd side of it. Yep. So I think it just sort of depends, but I get what he's trying to do. And so, I think now if I asked him if he could have bought more, he probably would say yes. So, so I think it's a good question. It is.
Tyler, is there anything else you'd like the listeners to know?
No, I mean, we covered quite a bit of ground there. And so, but it was enjoyable. You know, I think this is a pretty dynamic market that we're in right now. And, I think one thing I will say is, as an economist going out and giving these talks, it's very easy to talk about record prices. Because when I kind of started my career and really getting out into this, is like prices were starting to go down, right? And then you come in there and you're basically like the bearer of bad news, and people don't want to hear that. And I get it. I completely get it. And so I think I would be remiss to just say, like, there's going to be a point where this herd is going to turn, right? And so that's what you need to be planning for. And so I think where we're sitting right now, arguably we're not going to see that for 2, probably more like 3 years. And sort of my expectation, right? Because I do forecast out some of this stuff just sort of internally, basically the next cattle cycle, right? And so that's a decade, arguably, right? So I'm looking at, 2035, 36, right? So, kind of thinking the next 5 to 10 years, right? There's going to be another peak. But I think what we figured out, it's not going to be like what we saw a decade ago, where it's just this huge ramp up. I think that we have producers that much more savvy in how they run their operations. And so I think we figured out how to be much more efficient with the herd that we have, putting them on feed longer days, higher dress weights, better quality meat, right? And so we figured out how to be much more efficient, right? And that's economics, right? Mm-hmm. Maximizing the resource base that you have to maximize your profit. And so I think that's, to be in ag economics and see this, it's a pretty neat thing, because you hear about this stuff all in theory and you learn it in all your classes, but then actually see it playing out, it for me is pretty cool. So.
That's great. So our listeners can find Margin and Markets on your website. You also do a Monday email blast, which I would recommend everybody subscribe to. That can be subscribed to on your website as well, correct, Tyler?
Yes. Yeah, you can in the cattle markets. So just a quick plug on that one is, so that's our members write that one. So we have about 8 members that write that. And that comes out every Monday, and it's just sort of current topics, what's going on, cattle on feed, trade, things of that nature. So you kind of, if you want to get a perspective of some of our members across the U.S. and what they're looking at, and just sort of market intel, that's a good resource for you. And just another shameless plug for LMIC, we also do every other week. It's called Livestock Monitor, and that's articles that we write internally. LMIC staff write those. And so similar to some of the other things that we talked here, we're just kind of talking about current things that are going on within the markets. And with the Livestock Monitor, we're not just focused on cattle. We'll touch on hogs, poultry, dairy, lamb. So we kind of, all the things that we cover within our shop, we try to touch on those in Livestock Monitor. So if you're looking at things outside of the cattle market, we do a touch on that there. So shameless plug there.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great tool, as we were just discussing, to definitely plug into those things. Tyler, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a very insightful conversation, and I have enjoyed it. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of the AgNext Podcast, where we are always excited to tell you what is next from AgNext. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, X, LinkedIn, and Instagram. For feedback or suggestions, please email us at agnext.colostate.edu.